I think we've all, one time in our life or another, stepped on a tack or stubbed our toe or even bashed our head against an open cupboard, and we might have a quick reaction, a quick response before we even appreciate or sense the pain. This is going to be the discussion of this part 4 of Unit M and N, the nervous system. We're talking today about neurons, structure and function, and how they work together to make something like the reflex arc, something that you do when you step on a tack. So let's begin with looking at the vocabulary, neurons. We already mentioned in a previous part of this unit are the actual cells that make up this system. The three parts of them are going to be in order: the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon. So I remind myself DCA. This is going to be the order of how the impulse travels along. Then we're going to talk about how three different types of neurons, sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, make up a reflex arc. And we call it an arc because it starts out in the peripheral, it goes into the central, and it comes back out to the peripheral again. So peripheral, through the central, and back out in the peripheral. Okay, let's go. So neuron structure, we need to be able to identify, label, look at, and identify the parts of. This is one neuron we're looking at, so we're going to begin here. These highly branched areas are the dendrites, looking like twigs without their leaves on. This is where the impulse begins. And when we're talking about an impulse, we're talking about the nervous message, the way that the message is transmitted when you touch the stove all the way up your arm, into your spine, up your spine, and finally to your brain. Obviously happening very, very quickly. So the nervous message we can refer to as the impulse. It's going to begin in the highly branched dendrites. It moves through the cell body. The cell body is the place where we find the nucleus, and this is the center of the cell. So it would be the normal cell part of the neuron. From there, the message is going to go out along this long part of the neuron, the axon, and then end. And I really want you to notice these little swellings at the end. These are going to be the synaptic terminals or axon terminals, but we're going to use the word synapse, so we want to get used to hearing it. The synaptic terminals. This is where the message, the nervous message, is going to end. So as I said at the start, DCA, through the dendrite, through the cell body, and out through the axon. This axon we see actually has a coating on it, a fatty coating that is going to insulate the neuron and speed up the speed of the nervous impulse being transmitted, because the impulse is going to jump along the length from node to node. And these nodes are called nodes of Ranvier. And the cells that wrap around the long portion of the neuron are going to be called Schwann cells. They are the cells that are going to release this fatty covering the myelin sheath. So this entire covering would be the myelin sheath. This would be one Schwann cell, and these little openings where the Schwann cells don't quite cover the axon would be called the nodes of Ranvier. So three types of neurons that we have to know about. They are sensory neurons, so neurons that are going to feel, right? They're going to pick up sensory information. Interneurons are going to be connectors, neurons that connect, and motor neurons are going to be ones that are attached to muscles or glands, and they're going to be ones that cause a movement, a contraction, a reaction to the sensation that the sensory neuron picked up. So in my crystal ball, again, I can forecast and foresee that comparing motor neurons to sensory neurons would be a fabulous compare and contrast. One that should be already obvious to you at this point is the direction of information. So a sensory neuron is going from the peripheral nervous system towards the central. And so this would be dendrite, right? Long dendrite heading in, headed out from the central nervous system then towards the peripheral. So different direction would be a motor neuron. So sensory, peripheral to central, motor, central to periphery. What these three neurons then make together, they make what we call a reflex arc. So it really makes sense because we've all had a reflex. When somebody hits our patella, our brain thinks we're going to fall over, so it reacts, it reflexes without any conscious decision. The way this works, the sensory neuron right here, and really we'd want it back down there somewhere, picks up the sensation, carries it in towards the spine. So this gray matter is showing us this is the spine right here, cut in a little slice. It is going to connect in the middle of the spine through an interneuron, and then on the other side of the reflex arc is going to be a motor neuron, a neuron that ends in a muscle. And the motor neuron, when the nerve impulse arrives here at the synaptic terminals, will cause the muscle to contract, and we have the reflex. This all happens without any connection or any discussion to the brain. We might be aware of it, and we might get the information afterwards, but the reflex is going to occur without control of the conscious brain. Just looking at a slightly different diagram. Again, we need some eyeball clues, and I just want to point out to you some important clues. Here we're seeing sensory receptors. The receptors are what pick up the sensation in the first place. So when I stick a pin in your skin, it's the sensory receptors that pick the touch sensory receptors. They transmit the information along the dendrite of the sensory neuron. Here, this whole thing, this dendrite is myelinated. So here we see the nodes of Ranvier. The myelin sheath is created by the Schwann cells. This is the direction of the information. Here's the cell body. On the other side of the cell body, the axon. Well, how am I going to tell that this is the axon? I'm going to look for these little swellings, these little nubby nubs at the end of the axon. I'm going to look for these receptors at the beginning of the neuron. So you might have to stop it here, get out your diagram, make sure you've identified those parts. Connecting the two neurons and looking tinier, non-myelinated, is our interneuron, the one that's in the spine, in the central nervous system. Remembering the spine and the brain make up the central nervous system, so interneuron. Finish that off for you there. Here we're seeing the little swellings, the little nubby nubs at the end of the axon. So again, dendrite, cell body, axon. Going against the clock here. Here is our last neuron, the motor neuron, dendrite, cell body, and axon, ending with a skeletal muscle. So question, what part of what nervous system would this be? This would be the, hope you're saying it, somatic, because skeletal muscle are controlled by your voluntary motion. So the key ideas that we talked about today were the fact that a nerve impulse in one neuron travels through the dendrite, through the cell body, and out along the axon. And the axon, we're going to look for the swellings, the little nubby nubs at the end to help us visually identify which direction the impulse is traveling along the neuron. We need to be able to do that quickly. We also want to know the parts, the direction of information in a reflex arc, beginning in the sensory, peripheral nervous system into the interneuron, which is in the spine. So this is the central, out through the motor neuron, peripheral again, and ending in an effector. The effector is going to be a muscle or a gland. A muscle obviously will contract, a gland will secrete a hormone. Hope